Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Thank you all for being here on this beautiful evening. It's wonderful to see you all here taking part in this amazing exhibition that we've been very fortunate to host, and that is the work of the esteemed artist Stephanie Frostad. If you have not seen this exhibition, please do. The exhibition will be here until mid-June. If you have not seen it, please come and check it out. Bring your friends. It is a very moving exhibition. You will not regret doing that. If you've seen it, come back and enjoy it some more, because it's a real privilege to have this work here at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. So let me first give you some instructions about tonight's program. This is going to be a conversation, a dialogue between Lisa Simon and Anna Wilson and Stephanie Frostad. And essentially, Anna and Lisa will be posing questions to Stephanie, and Stephanie will talk about her work and about her life and her thinking. So let me give you a very brief introduction, and as you can tell, I have a bit of a frog, so I will try to make this brief and spare you this grovelly, awful voice. So, first of all, let me introduce the panelists, the discussants. So we have Lisa Simon, and many of you know Lisa Simon. She's a humanities scholar and an art activist, among the premier art activists in this town. She's also a very successful gallery owner and art devotee in this town. She has a PhD in literary modernism. Many of you know that from the University of Washington in Seattle. And since 2014, Lisa and her husband Jason, who's out there in the audience, have opened and have been directing Radius Gallery downtown, which is really a wonderful showcase for contemporary art in our community. And it's more than just an art gallery. I mean, it is a hub, a cultural hub, and a great place for that conversation, that wonderful conversation that this town always has concerning the visual arts and our creative community. So welcome, Lisa, and thank you very much for doing this. Anna Wilson is a graduate student in literature and ecology, and she has a particular interest in the West, Western ideas, Western thoughts. She's in the field, and actually she has an MFA in creative writing from Louisiana State University. But she's very interested in these arenas, and let me just read to you: indigenous futurism, science fiction, apocalypticism. I'll let her explain what that is. It doesn't sound good, does it? Anyway, she teaches writing and literature here at the university, and makes textually active visual art herself. So she is indeed an artist in her own right, from working from small books to the large video installations, and she's also a great printmaker as well. And I know her quite well because she has been a graduate assistant in many of my art history classes. So Anna, welcome, Anna Wilson. Now, let's talk about Stephanie Frostad. 25 years ago, almost to the day, I came to Missoula, Montana to interview for my previous job as a faculty member in the School of Art. And as part of my interview process, it was expected that I would meet with graduate students, do critiques with these students. And I had the pleasure of meeting Stephanie Frostad as a graduate student here in the spring of 1994. So a couple of months shy of her graduation, maybe even like less than a month shy of her graduating from the MFA program here. And I remember thinking at that point, wow, this is a very, very brave woman. And I'll tell you why I thought. Not only did I think, wow, she's extremely talented, and we had a beautiful conversation, if I remember correctly. It wasn't really a critique, it was more a conversation about truth, beauty, and the meaning of life, something like that. But I remember thinking remember being impressed by her bravery. And here's what made her brave in my mind. Here she was, a naturalistic painter, dealing with realism, swimming in a sea of sharks. This was a time, you have to remember, 25 years ago, when abstraction was the name of the game in the visual arts. We were teaching abstract expressionism through and through, and minimalism through and through, and conceptualism through and through. And here was somebody who was working with recognizable imagery. She was working with symbolism, powerful symbolism. And I thought, my God, if she can survive this, she can survive anything. And here she is, 25 years later, the triumphant hero. At one level, what we realize is that the art world is a very facile, moving, changing, ever-changing thing, and it's also very faddish. And so I congratulate her for her tenacity, her courage, her vision, and her stick-to-itiveness. This idea that she is clearly very well educated, very literate, very thoughtful about her work. She's a master, there's no question, in terms of her craftsmanship and her aesthetics and her beautiful production. But she has been a visionary artist who has had an ideal and has persisted in that ideal for at least a quarter century. And so that takes a lot of chutzpah. So congratulations, and thank you so much for doing that. So let me just give you some kudos while we're here, and then I will step off this podium and hand it over to the reason why you're here. So Stephanie received her BFA from the Maryland Institute, the College of Art, in 1990, 4 years before coming here. And then she completed her MFA in painting at the University of Montana in 1994. And since then, she has become an artist of international reputation, without a doubt, won numerous awards. In fact, in 1994, that year after graduating from here, she received the Montana Arts Council Individual Artist Fellowship, and it has been a meteoric rise ever since. Her work is represented in many, many private collections and museums around the world, and she's received numerous awards and commissions, and is really one of our stellar figures in this art community. We should be very, very proud to have her in our midst. And on that note, I will step away. Oh, I can have one other little brief announcement, and before I forget, and that is that if you're interested in doing tours of this exhibition, the Montana Museum of Art and Culture would be more than happy to assist you in doing that. All you need to do is have 5 people, and we will put together a tour for you. So Herb Swick, there's Herb there. Please stand up. Herb has sheets like this, and just fill it out. You're welcome to fill it out tonight. Hand it to Herb, and he will set you up on a tour of the exhibition. So come back and enjoy the show. Thank you, ladies.
Hi, thank you. So I wanted to give you a little context of why we chose to do it this way, because it was originally a talk. So a little context and then a little bit about the structure that we're attempting tonight. We've been talking about doing this kind of structure for a while, but we're going to actually try it tonight. So the seed of this came in the planning for our second exhibit of what was the most popular and commercially successful exhibit at Radius, which was the Julia Galloway, Stephanie Frostad show in 2017. It was just wonderful, and there was so much community support for it. It was just fabulous. And we love showcasing these two Missoula artists together. And even though they do very different work, their work spoke to each other in a way that was really exciting for a lot of people. And we did an interview style with Julia, me, and Stephanie at that time, and it was like this, standing room only. And we just swore that we'd do it again. But in the debriefing, we were like, why was that so powerful? What is the excitement point? The reasons kind of came down to, these are two very intellectual women at the height of their careers who are consciously working within the European Western tradition, and that's with all its magnificence and its saturation of beauty. But they're also keenly aware in criticizing its flaws. That is, the hostility that it has traditionally had toward women and minorities, and the selective recording of history that is in that tradition. And these, both Stephanie and Julia are working within that tradition in the context of the American West, which tends to be, despite marching on of time, preoccupied with masculinity and 19th century romantic ideals of itself. So I think that part of the excitement around both Julia and Stephanie is like, these are powerful women being philosophical and thoughtful, and we get to see their work, and we don't get to see a lot of that work. So that's part of the excitement in it. And we're just thrilled to be able to observe that. So within this larger engagement where we said we were going to do another show sometime, that Stephanie told me that there was a retrospective planned, and I thought that was just such a smart idea on the part of MMAC, and just the programming around it has been really terrific. But one of my reactions was, aren't you too young and too alive to have a retrospective? And Stephanie said, well, actually, she showed some apprehension, like, yeah, I am a little worried that these 25 years are going to sort of fix me in time, like this is who I am. And so even back then, we were like, okay, we've got to do something. We've got to have a conversation that also makes it clear that she's going to be painting for another 25 years. And this is just a pause in the middle of a career to experience and appreciate what she's done so far and get ready. So we're all ready for the next 25 years. So we planned the second Frostad and Galloway show, and it is opening on the 29th, and I sent around some postcards for it. And I also have we know this is going to be a super popular show, so we're going to do a preview the night before the opening that's unadvertised. So if you aren't already on our buyers list and you'd like to be invited to that preview, I'm going to pass around a clipboard. Just give your email and we'll send you an invite to that. So then that's a little the genesis of where this talk starts. And then the structure of the talk, we were thinking about how in the tours, you sort of randomly go from image to image and you talk about that. But and it's really exciting and interesting, and if you haven't done it, do it. But for those of us who are super fans, like, we know that there's great depth to her work. And where do we get to talk about that? When do we get to dig in, roll up our sleeves and dig into that? So we decided to design a talk that would work in steps, where we would at least attempt to get at some of the deeper ideas that recur in Stephanie's work. So we've designed it in 3 acts. And I know that might seem a little rigid, but we decided to put up boundaries so we could have spontaneous conversation within those boundaries. So the first one is the layering of image and idea. And the way that in Stephanie's work, the main image is inviting to a lot of people. And then the ideas behind it, you have to work to get into those. And so these 2 layers that are really important. So we're both going to talk about that. And then within that area, Anna, since she's been working with this show and doing tours of it, she's going to represent the retrospective. And I'm going to just think about what Stephanie's been doing in the last 2 years and thinking about where she might be going in the future. So we're going to start in this section, and then Act 2 is the evocative moment, which is the name of the show. So it's the here and now, the particular, and then the shared tradition, which is those larger ideas and the whole system of illusion that Stephanie works with quite a lot. And then last, we hope that what's coming here allows us to address something that isn't often addressed in Western art, is gender and feminism. And so we thought we would just take that on straight on. So that is our structure. I think that's... And so we're going to start with this idea of the image being this wide gate that sort of invites anyone and everyone to come into this pictorial surface. And behind there are some really powerful ideas waiting for you. So Anna's going to start with that.
just like to thank everyone for coming.
Yeah, and thank you to you all. I also just quickly want to acknowledge Kat for recording the talk, and that is streaming on community television and will be streaming at a later date as well. So thank you, and thank you, and thank you, Kat. I've sort of jotted down my questions in the interest, hopefully, of brevity. So I'll be reading them off a little bit, thinking about conversations we've had after looking at the work a lot. So you mentioned that you posed for the mother and the father and the returning son in The Return of the Prodigal Son, large painting of that series that's here in the gallery. And I was curious what it's like to sort of think of yourself in those roles that could be conflicted, if not opposing, in that process of sort of layering meaning behind that surface image of a familiar tale.
Well, I must say, so I'm the most convenient model. I'm always there. I've got a self-timer on my camera, and I can even do the poses from The Return of the Prodigal Son on the hillside. My identification in that image is really with the dutiful son, and maybe to some extent with the cow and calf in the foreground. And it doesn't feel. I think there's some way I become removed from my own image once it becomes a character in the work. That said, I feel like part of what was so instructive to me personally about working through that series is, even though the prodigal son was a sort of villain to me as I conceived of the work, the sense of mercy, which is at the heart of the tale, ended up influencing my attitude to everyone. The grateful parents happy to see their son again, the remorseful wastrel, as well as the dutiful son who's been there so reliably.
Thanks, yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I wondered when you identified that in that painting, you didn't mention whether you posed yourself for the dutiful son. And I feel like that and what you just said sort of highlights the moral complexity that you tend to raise up, even in a story that maybe typically has been boiled down into a more simplified message. Do we need to move on to you, or okay? I guess follow-up, I was thinking about the models more generally and how that sort of literally brings your community into these stories that reach as far back as sort of narrative and visual art history goes. So maybe you could talk about sort of bringing your community here now into the tableaus that you create.
Well, I see at least a couple here now, 2 or 3, maybe 4 people who've modeled for me. And I think that, for one thing, when I work, and this is probably the biggest step from bright and early, that first painting that's here in the exhibition, to anything I've done since, is that I started relying on photographs and having people model for me or modeling for myself, because I wanted greater specificity and to achieve things in terms of positions and gestures or facial expressions that I couldn't come up with very well naturalistically from memory. So what happens is we get together and I have an idea, maybe even a thumbnail of what I'd like to depict. But once we are together and we're pretending, sort of like kids pretend, new ideas occur to me. And something that I thought would be natural and interesting isn't. And what happens instead is. So there's an element of collaboration. I think the other thing that can happen as I handle these photos is these folks are present with me in the studio where otherwise I'm working alone. So even if it's not a portrait, you know, these people have lent their images to me. I'm not making portraits of them. My care for them how they exist in my consciousness is there, and I think it helps deepen my attachment and intimacy with them as characters in the work, even though, again, they're not portraits or biographical. So, does that...
Yeah, thank you. So thinking of where these ideas go into the future is a painting never seen before outside of Stephanie's studio, and it's going to be in the Radius show.
Use the mic.
Sorry. This painting is called Summit, and I just wanted you to tell the story behind it, if you would.
Yes, well, here's maybe another example of how community can shape what's on my mind and lead into image making for me. Julia Galloway, Jason, Neil, Lisa, and I had supper together last summer at Julia's house, and I think there's been another terrible incident like spectacle murder or something, and we were lamenting what's going on in our society now. And Jason said something, to paraphrase, are things getting better or are things getting worse? And I felt like we could all sort of rush in with examples of what seems to be getting worse. And Julia, bless her heart, sort of played devil's advocate and started calling attention to advances we've made, I think specifically of how unimaginable it was 30 years ago to have gay marriage, for example. And that conversation has stuck with me as I am inclined to lament so many things that are going on in the world today. What are we forgetful of in terms of the advances we've made? So in this scenario, I have these man and woman moving up the slope, and their trail where they've been sort of disappears or disintegrates behind them. And yet, even as they reach one summit, they can see that there's another mountain higher up. And so to me, this is kind of a representation of losing some consciousness of the past, maybe even in a positive way, as we look forward to the advances we seek to make.
So I thought this story was sort of quintessential of how you operate, how I heard you describe how you operate, in that you use your active, like your creative art making, to think through ideas. So the whole time, like the many industrious hours that you spent doing this painting, you meditate. Yeah, you meditate on the topic. So is art making sort of a type of philosophical agency?
Sometimes I feel like I stand around and philosophize all day. I really do. Obviously, I'm moving paint and graphite and handling the materials, but it's a way of being engaged with ideas and experiences, hopes and prayers even, to a certain extent. And so, I think the other thing to mention in that is, I think because the work is produced from my pondering, it isn't declarative. It might evoke a story, but it doesn't illustrate a story, partly because it's infused by many hours and many thoughts and feelings about what's transpiring, both in terms of what I've depicted and what's going on for me over the course of 70 or 100 hours.
So here's the follow-up, the tough one, that. So then, as you work on this painting for many, many hours, and you're meditating as you do it, and you're seeing your ideas going into the painting, almost quite literally. What in your schematic, you're like, how does it work that those ideas get out? How are they transferred to an audience? And maybe I've heard you talk about memory, like your memory is in the painting in a way that's complicating what might seem like a simple image of two people walking up the hill. Is your meditation in the image as well?
I know this sounds sort of mystical, but I think we can imbue objects with our spirit when we lavish time or handle them over and over again. And I think that sometimes there is something instilled in a work of art that remains ineffable, but still moves us. I can't claim that all my images do that, but it's certainly an experience I have with art. I feel like you're asking if I trust that someone can get where I'm coming from in composing that particular painting.
Well, I've heard you talk about them being sort of prayers, but I almost, in how you describe that, it seems like they're almost prayers to your viewers more than some higher power. Like you're hoping the complexity of your thought is conveyed, and you bring the people into that complexity of ideas that you're thinking of. Is that not true?
Yeah, I think so. I for some reason, not quite maybe getting to where you're going with that.
Here, let me try again. So I'm thinking that you put all this thought in, and you have some intention that it arise out of that image. Mm-hmm. And I was just interested in, like, this is a real question. I don't have an answer in my head. Do you have an idea of how that works? That the ideas get back out?
Well, I think that's part of the reason beauty and order are important to me. Art touches us in a pre-verbal state. So before you can name cow, mom, dad, prodigal son, calf, tree, any of that, there's an arrangement of colors and values, lines and arts and things that start to act on you in a sensual and emotional way. And so for me, part of the reason I remain devoted to beauty and compositional order in my work is because I think it creates a space people want to stay with long enough to begin reading deeper.
That's exactly where I thought you were going. Okay, so we're moving on to Act 2. One of the ways that you're able to layer or load up your paintings with meaning is through the time-honored practice of allusion. That is, you allude to shared cultural stories, mythological, biblical, folklore. So our Act 2 is the evocative moment, which is the particular things, and these are those choices you're making, individually to create tension, and that connects to the shared tradition. So we see those, as we're in the gallery, we see those 4 gorgeous horses, and as you get closer, you see that each one has a little vignette of people and there seems to be some tension and conflict, or tension within those little scenes. And, so you're already in layer number 2, and then you look at the title, and it's the 4 horses of the apocalypse. This is no horsey picture. This is, she's alluding to a wide and deep history in the Western culture. So that's my transition into Anna's question.
And I will ask about the 4 horsemen, probably not surprisingly after the introduction, but I was particularly interested in the Gleaners, and that brought up for me something that's present in all of them and throughout your work, but sort of interweaving traditions in our interactions with the natural world and our cultural traditions. So we have stories of biblical apocalypse that's been reworked by many artists, but then these beautiful landscapes that also represent work and toil and struggle. So wondered if you could talk about sort of interweaving those cultural traditions and heritage with our traditional evolving relationship with the land.
Well, I think part of the reason I love the rural landscape as an environment for a variety of scenarios is because where wilderness and civilization meet and intermingle. And so we have the possibility of alluding to the Bible or classical myth. At the same time, we can look at how we actually engage with the elements, with other creatures, wild and domestic, and work for the most fundamental sustenance, which metaphorically could be the sort of sustenance that actually keeps us alive spiritually, too.
In the Gleaners painting of that fort, I was thinking of the Gleaners painting by Millet and the many sort of reworkings of that theme. And we talked a little bit about gleaning, which is, I think of it as a lost tradition. And so I was thinking about the black horse being related to need and lack and famine and depletion. And he's, hovering in front of people who are, on a land that would be considered already harvested, and they're harvesting what's left over, which is an act of conservation in many ways. So I wondered if you could talk about conservation, both in terms of lifting up elements in Western art that could still be of use and beautiful and of use, and then lifting up some of these rural traditions, especially that sort of both form like a common ground, but maybe we're losing sight of that common value. I'm rambling a little bit, but
right. Well, I speaking of layering, I feel like just up front, if you know nothing about how I've reinterpreted the four horsemen of the apocalypse and so on, the painting supports the ethic of gleaning, waste not, want not. It's pretty simple in that regard. Actually, when I posted this image on Facebook, not alluding at all to the four horsemen of the apocalypse or any of that, some fellow I don't know commented, "Oh, there, the rich man's horse stands gleaming in the field with the poor people scavenging for food in the distance." And it was, a really passionate sort of remark, but he was so close. I mean, in some ways so close to seeing that there were two realms, and that horse kind of stood in front of what was happening beyond. If I may, I'd just like to explain a little bit about the four horsemen and the four horses as they appear in my work. So the four horsemen of the apocalypse appear in the book of Revelation as the harbingers of our doom. They represent the red horse of war, the black horse of famine, the white horseman of plague, and the pale horseman of death. So I've often used horses in this color palette to signal the kind of adversity people are struggling with in the landscape. And it just, as an adult, kind of reinterpreting what I was exposed to in Sunday school, I see these are actually the challenges, scarcity, loss, conflict, and illness or injury, those kind of physical vulnerability. These are the things we have to contend with in order to survive. So that's how I became engaged with that imagery. And the black horse in the Gleaners painting that we're mentioning is the horse that represents famine or lack. And as I mentioned before, the sort of lack, they're out there gleaning the potato fields, which is something I did as a kid. It's not that alien to me, and obviously people still do it, but what other sustenance might we lack? And I think that's where someone can maybe bring their own sense of need or scarcity to work, even if it's not food that's scarce in their lives.
That's great, thanks.
So in thinking of what I've seen in your work in the last 2 years, I wanted to bring the tools image in, which is actually over here. So there were 4 of these in the 2017 show, and just a woman's hand with a tool. And there are 10 in this upcoming show, is it 10? You gave me the number.
More than 10.
More than 10. And a good 7 or 8 of them are in very vibrant colors. I mean, colors you've never seen in a Stephanie Frostad painting.
Except along the river trail.
Oh, yeah. In fact, you said your apartment was starting to feel a little carnival-esque because you have these in there. And I wonder if this isn't more of the direction you're going, or maybe it's, but it does seem like a departure in that there isn't, like you can't read a narrative into that. So it has the symbolism of a lot of your past work, but there's not a narrative, except in the fact that maybe you keep painting them. So there's, and the more there are, the more there's a narrative. I'm seeing them as Frostad's army of art activists. So there's in them sort of a call to action. And I get a swords into plowshares feeling about them. So can you talk a little bit about where these are coming from?
Yes, well, and the first 4, I call the series the hands-on series. And the first 4 were actually almost another iteration of what I did with the Furies, and including the Second Wind 1 and 2 paintings that were in that show years ago, where I just wanted some sense of empowerment, and I didn't necessarily want to deal with social signifiers to a great extent. So just reducing everything down to the hand and the tool seemed like a way to do that. It's also reflective of sort of a technical curiosity I've been working with. I love creating illusory space, and it's just fun. I just love it. But I'm also interested in symbolic space, and that's part of what's ambiguously achieved in those 4 horses paintings. Is the horses sort of stand almost two-dimensionally in front of what's unfolding in a deeper illusory space. So working with just enough of the figure to occupy just enough space that they become somehow palpable without necessarily elaborating on a scenario or creating a narrative is something I want to explore, certainly. Also, as I was reflecting on this show, someone confronted me on the night of the opening and said, "Tell me what the narrative is here, and tell me what the narrative is in that. Tell me," and sort of kidding me, but I realized in some ways what I do, there is an evocation of or implication about narrative, what came before, what might come after, and I hope to encourage speculation about what is unfolding there. But the truth is, a lot of my work might also be referred to as genre painting. It's not scenes of everyday life because it's fiction. Like, I'm not just observing people doing these things. But it's just sort of that pause. You see a character in place, and is it enough to make a story? And I'm not sure it always is enough to make a story.
No, and that kind of gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning, is you make these choices that create a sense of questions, I think, and that's part of how you lead people into it. And there's been a ton of, the 4 that were up in the last show, people would go right over to them, and lots of speculation whether or not it was hammers and sickles, whether they were weapons or farm tools. And so I remember you being surprised by the weapon part. Like, really?
George Gokus. He's here. No, he's gone now. George came up to me and said, "Don't be so angry." He knows I was concerned about, and still am, our political situation. So, anyhow, that's how he read them.
Well, that is actually a great transition into Act 3, which is gender and feminism. In going to this, we're thinking about not only what it is to be a woman painter and bringing the lives of women into a central focus and trying to break out of the rules, the rigid rules that women have been given in most of literary and art history. If you don't know what those 6 rules are, they are daughters, mothers, goddesses on one hand, and monsters, whores, and slaves on the other. So trying to break out of those, but also how gender impacts how your work is interpreted. And I was wondering if you wouldn't tell us the story of, I've forgotten the name of the painting.
How do the pigs bless? How do the pigs bless?
Which is the one that you see in the entry, and where clearly it's Stephanie as the model, leaning in a doorway with that beautiful glow. So tell the story and the reaction to that.
It is remarkable to me that when I talk with people about the work, there are sometimes really gendered responses. And to that painting, repeatedly, men would say, she's waiting for her husband to come home. She's mad because he's late, or she's calling in the kids. And, I just really, really saw her in terms of someone waiting for someone else. And whether her attitude was positive or negative, whether it was kids or husband, that was really how it was read. And where over and over again, so many women would come to me and say, oh, she's like breathing a sigh of relief or taking in the cool of the evening. And really consistently, I would hear these two different responses to a single work, which is just interesting. It's part of what instructs me about making the work public.
My question is about some of the sort of recognizable women of literature, women of story, and I'm thinking of, Eve depicted on Style, watching the snake, pass through this little special entrance for snakes.
It's a snoot.
A snoot. And then there's Atalanta. I mean, there's women depicted in all kinds of circumstances, but would you describe these works as sort of revisioning their stories or their places, or would you describe it in some other terms?
I might need to be more particular to an image, whether I feel I'm revising or seek to revise something, or to sustain something I believe is and was powerful, like in the case of Atalanta. So, very definitely, my frequent return to that kind of founding biblical tale of the fall and grace. I really do want to see Eve as someone with choices and who can regain a connection to the natural world and other people around her. In this case, as you observe, there's a snake there, and she's not either conspiring with it, nor afraid of it, nor acting to harm it, but somehow they both have passage back and forth in whatever realms that wall divides. The sacred and the profane, the cultivated and the uncultivated, however you might see it.
Yeah, I think this is just occurring to me too. You don't have to go into kind of the story of the wall, but in that painting, it's interesting because the wall, Eve is allowed the choice in the painting, and then this wall is like a technology that also sort of enables a different unfolding, and that sort of relates to the way you see and depict use of tools throughout your painting, which I think in the hands of women is a theme that I really enjoyed. I don't have a follow-up question on that, but
So mine, in moving forward, we brought in this painting called Edge of the Woods. So this is one that's going to be in the next show. And walking through the retrospective again, I thought that one of the ways that you bring agency and power to women is just by giving them a sense of interiority. Like you see these figures and they are thinking. They are thinking people. And that is not shown very, that's kind of a thing that you do consistently that I think gives agency to women. And your weather systems, which you have often said are the emotional, what did you describe?
Well, they create the emotional atmosphere, and sometimes circumstances that precipitate a certain kind of action, but I think mostly I rely on you for emotional atmosphere.
So I looked at this painting, and clearly there's a woman at the edge of the woods, and she's running from something, and there seems to be some danger evoked in it. And I went and looked for that in your, like, do we ever see a woman in danger? And this doesn't seem like the weather is causing it. There's something else causing this danger. And I think that might, again, be a way that you're signaling a crisis, or signaling something that, that's a change. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, I remember when I made this painting, two things were happening. I was reading Enemy Women by Paulette Giles, and I'm very influenced by what I read. So, and yeah, so that's always informing, or like maybe fueling my imagination. And it was also at perhaps a sort of acme in the Me Too movement. And so some of the imagery from the book and what I was hearing on the radio or reading in the news conflated to create this scenario, to think about where, because the character in this book, it's not an illustration for the book, but you know, she is in flight, and she takes flight through the woods, and she knows the thing she has most to fear in the woods is men. Not pitfalls, not wild animals, and so on. And so it's sort of her travail. The story follows her travail. And so at the same time, I'm hearing all these stories about how, perhaps above all, women are made to feel like they don't belong somewhere, that they don't have the same right to belong and be comfortable in a place. And I think deep in our folklore and stories, the girl that gets lost in, or enchanted, or transformed, or consumed by wolves, or whatever, in the woods becomes this scary sort of place for women. And so that's how this imagery, again, it was sort of a conflation of things that were on my mind and heart because of news and literature.
And speaking of news, the bird in that.
Right, and so the other thing I may introduce now, and more of this work will be on view at Radius Gallery, but I learned in Nordic mythology, or Norse mythology, the god Odin is accompanied by two ravens, Hugin and Munin. Hugin is translated as thoughts, and Munin as memory. And what these ravens would do is they'd go out each day and gather news of the world and bring it back to Odin. They were like his reconnaissance. And this just made so much sense to me, because we know ravens have that intelligence to gather and share news. And it also seemed to me like a lot of our leaders are not listening to reason and historical consciousness. So this is me sort of shifting the symbolism a little bit. So there's a whole body of work in which Hugin and Munin appear. And here, this is actually the fourth iteration of that image, because at first I had the raven sort of swirling in an ellipse around the figure, and it seemed like it was from them she was running, or that they were part of a fright for her. So that was one thing that ended up needing to change. And so what I've done in that body of work is just have these birds as observers of some of the crises in our culture. Again, this is all pretty allegorical, but that's part of the reason the ravens appear there, and even in the summit painting. It's smaller gestures.
We've made it through all three acts. So, questions? Anyone else? Go in any direction you like.
We answered them all.
Yes?
In your Facebook post, you always put a quote with the picture, which to me speaks a lot to the image that you're showing and enhances it. And my question is, do you use the same quote for different images from time to time, or do you try to use, these quotes are famous people. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, so I really employ a lot of verbal imagery. Sometimes I actually start with word ideas and kind of wait and muse on something for the visual language to occur. So it's been fun for me in using my archive of images on Facebook and pairing them with a quote of the day. And yes, and sometimes if there's a quote I really like, I can apply it to a different image, and then they read into each other in a different way. But I think maybe it's important to just explain, and a number of people have asked me about this, I haven't made the paintings to illustrate the quotes. They often come from very different places, but a number of people have thought that somehow that's what was happening there. Kathy?
So, I'm really interested in this process. I mean, part of what has hit me through this conversation is like, that is three really smart women. You guys are wonderful, thank you. But there's so much cogitation obviously necessary to launch this work, right? But then there's been this quote that keeps showing up in different Facebook feeds that I see that's recently about how you enter the studio with like everybody you know and everything they're all there and they're all populating, and as you work, people leave, and under the perfect circumstances, you leave. And there's just the process of doing the work. So I'd be interested in hearing what's your understanding of how it works for you to be able to do the thinking and cogitating and imagining that's sort of the metaphorical thumbnail for what you're going to make. And then how you clear all that out, because I can't imagine that actually making the objects don't involve sort of emptying all that cogitation, right, out of the space.
I'm not sure that's true for me, Kathy. If I'm understanding your question right, I think that I gain pleasure in the layering up. Yes, I want to reach that self-forgetfulness you described, but I don't think that means me forgetting the possible perspectives or interpretations that might be brought to the work. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
And another thing I might mention, just in terms of the genesis of the work, is you've actually been an inspiration to me in how my process is changing. I remember you explaining specifically in your painting that you put something down and then you wait and figure out what goes with it, and build in a less predetermined way. Build your painted images in a less predetermined way, and that's something I'm trying to do more too. Create a process that I can revise more dramatically as I go along, so that I'm still discovering right up to the very end. Did you have a...
I do. I just had the opportunity to be in Washington, D.C. and had a little bit of time in the National Gallery, which was amazing, and also completely inspiring and incredibly disappointing in that the proportion of paintings by people who are not white men is unbelievable. And of course I kept thinking, Stephanie should be in this gallery. And yeah, I also know that you are, yes, I agree. I also know that you're someone who really respects and values tradition and has learned from tradition. And so I'm curious if you could just speak to that potential tension between learning from not just a teacher, but an entire tradition that is totally not representative, and yet allowing yourself to be informed by that, and also being a disruptor. And how do you, I'd like to hear you think out loud about that.
Yeah, well, when I was really starting to formulate my own interest and dedication to pictorial art, I was reading Audre Lorde, who we spoke of the other day, and a poet and essayist, a particular essay entitled, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." And in that essay, she's critiquing a feminist symposium in which she was asked to participate as the voice of blackness, right? And so the critique is, if you're going to bring the same kind of tokenism and generalization into this feminist symposium, you are just replicating a patriarchal structure. So I respect what she did in that essay, but that phrase so fascinated me, because perhaps it's my privilege as an educated white woman, but I think there just might be things in the master's house that are worth salvaging. And so I feel like part of my practice, even technically, what I work with, how I work that mode, as well as how I revisit narratives and maybe conjure up some archetypes, especially ones that might be recognizable to us here in the Northwest or the Mountain West, is part of an exploration of figuring out what can we hang on to from that history, from that edifice, that might still enrich our lives, and what can we let go or so transform that it's no longer serving the purpose it once did, especially if it's a purpose of exclusion or disrespect or some other way it delimits human experience.
Stephanie, I have a question. Arts advocacy is a kind of category in the arts today. It's an important element in contemporary art. And I wonder how comfortable you are with the title of an arts advocate. And if so, there's clearly an agenda to arts advocacy. Do you have an agenda if you wear that title comfortably?
I'll let me answer. No.
I've never referred to myself as such, but I would like to be an advocate for art because I believe the art has so much to teach us. Art has so much to teach us as a culture and a society. And so I think my agenda, if there was such a thing, would be to try to make things as accessible as possible. And what Lisa, just within the scope of my practice as an artist, what Lisa was describing initially in terms of that first layer is really easy to get into and appreciate, and there are aspects of craft too that are sort of welcoming, and then you have a chance to go deeper. But the other thing I feel I must do is just make sure I'm not getting in the way of anyone else who has a different expression and celebrate the diversity. I just believe that aesthetic pluralism is essential to liberal democracy, and so we need to be seeing, quite a range of things in order to reflect the scope of experience, honor and reflect the scope of experience in our society.
I do want to hear what Lisa has to say.
Yes, absolutely, she's an art advocate. I mean, just the way that she invites in, and the way that she creates images that you haven't seen before. And she's for young women who don't see themselves in art except the 6 categories I mentioned earlier. It's nice to see in women with a sense of interiority, and women who are picking up tools and working. In those ways, you're inviting a whole host of people into art that could only appreciate its beauty without identifying with it. You've added this layer of identification that's really important for raising strong women. So absolutely, without question. Anyone else have a question for Stephanie that I could jump in and take?
Well, thank you, folks. Thank you, Stephanie, Anna, and Lisa. And go enjoy this exhibition while it's still here. Thank you. And don't forget to sign up.